Hello and welcome to episode 24 of The Dive. We have Froskurinn this time because we're going to talk a little bit about play-ins later. We had last week off because of the group chaw, but it's Worlds time. I mean, Worlds is going to start by the time this airs, probably in like 52 hours or something. Don't quote me on that. Check all these sports for the schedule.
That number
but it's
was
soon.
much less excited than the 24.
It is soon.
Which I really liked, by the way.
Yeah. We had to do a false start there, and I wasn't as excited, so I had to amp it up.
Anyways,
Kobe 24. Kobe.
Welcome, Froskurinn here.
Yes.
Enough with the 24s, though. How are you doing this morning,
Yeah,
afternoon?
I got here pretty early, so pretty good. Excited about plans. Get to cast plans.
Here to flame some Redditors, perhaps?
I'm definitely, it's Twitter.
Oh,
Yeah.
Twitter people. Okay.
Speaking of flame, we should start with the top 20 list that came
Yeah,
out
let's flame Jet.
really early this morning. For those of you who don't know, because it wasn't super clear when the article first launched, it's very similar to last year. Last year, it was me, Deficio, and Spawn who made a list. This year, it was me, Deficio, and Papa Smithy, who all made our own top 20 lists and then basically combined them to make the LoL Esports top 20 that you see. And there's like a lot of criteria being thrown around for like inconsistencies in logic, like, oh, but he wasn't good at last year's Worlds, he was good at this year's Worlds. The simplest way I can put it is it's trying to predict how good this player will be at Worlds, using whatever you think is going to happen, whether you're someone who values history, whether you're someone who's not, current performance, patch, all that stuff is kind of just how good are they going to be at Worlds. So what do you think of the list?
It's interesting. I mean, I always think this stuff is very fun, particularly because everyone is going to have their own criteria for it, right? You talk a little bit about your criteria and the start of the video. If you guys do want more context,
Yeah,
you
there
should
is a
go
video
watch.
on YouTube that's like an hour of
Yeah.
us talking about the top 20 lists.
And they all have their own ideas on what makes a player great, which everyone is going to. But I mean, I'm going to kind of start it off with just the fact that there was only 2 junglers and 2 top laners on the list. And I don't know what you thought about that, Kobe, but I was a bit surprised at the lack of jungle and top laner presence. And I know that, you know, kind of the idea is that these roles are perhaps less impactful right now, or at least less flashy. You know, they're kind of more supportive style roles oftentimes. So that makes it harder for them to get on the list. But like, I don't think that the junglers have gotten worse, really.
So I don't think the individual players have gotten worse. I do understand why there would be less of these positions right now because there's so many tanks in these positions, and skill expression on tanks is just so much more difficult to actually get across than on, you know, AD carries or any sort of DPS member, right? The difference between a glass cannon 10 performance and a glass cannon 5 performance, you gain so much more for the team fight with the 10 than a tank on 5 versus a tank on 10 because there's just a much bigger margin for error on tanks simply to the design of the champion. You're supposed to like take hits and make more errors. So in that sense, it does make sense to me. I was a little bit surprised that there are only 2 of each, as you were saying, but it does definitely make sense.
But like in that same vein, if we're talking about, you know, the what we expect will be the top performing players at Worlds, you then also have to kind of project the meta, and things like Ezreal and Nidalee are probably going to be strong contenders coming back in.
Those could be big.
And so suddenly, you know, if Blank and Peanut aren't on this list, and then you have these very aggressive, you know, heavy farming, heavy ganking, fast-paced, high-tempo junglers coming back in, people like Contracts, people like Blank and Peanut suddenly become much more valuable than your, you know, your Cinderhulk tank-oriented junglers.
But I would say one thing that I think we're kind of doing a bit of disservice to tank players or to the more supportive style is not giving enough credence to how important the decision making is and how much of a difference that can make. And while I do certainly agree within the actual mechanical play, you know, an incredible Zed play looks much more amazing than incredible Maokai play and this sort of thing. But to me, the great Maokai is more about this guy's always in the right place at the right time, right? It's always knowing when to engage and finding those engages and those sorts of things. So I still do think that you can really get these incredible performances from tanks. It's just harder to appreciate. But I was surprised to see not Blank. That's the biggest one for me that he didn't make top 20.
Yeah, I'll touch on that a little bit. Like having fewer top laners on the list, I had to do a lot of like figuring out how I look at the game here, because are top laners not, or do we actually have 2 top laners as the top 20 players at Worlds, or are we just looking for the wrong things? But then it did actually go down to kind of Kobe's point where which top laner am I then putting above, at least for me, like Scout on the list? Or which top laner am I putting above Sven or Doublelift, Condi, like all these guys that did make the list, and the difference that they would make into the game wasn't there because we have 120 starters going to Worlds and like 20 players making this list. So it did end up being very carry focused, at least this year.
And I think then it kind of comes into question. It's like, are you rating who you think are the best individual players, or are you rating who you think the players are going to be the most effective, also including role, right? And if it's just this guy is going to be the most effective as a combination of his player skill plus his role, then it makes more
Yeah.
sense to me.
Well, I'd ask you that, like, which top laners would you put on the list?
I mean, it's hard, I guess, to put guys above this, but I think jungle was more where I was looking. Like I wouldn't have
Blank.
blank for
Yep.
sure. Smithy, I could see an argument for over some of these guys, like maybe making the list just looking from NA perspective. But blank was the biggest one for me. I think that
Yeah.
it's hard. Like
I ended up throwing blank at 24, and like
Mm.
I agree, he's good, but he also wasn't the full-time starter. And if he yes, he did come in and save the day for Peanut like a lot of different times, but
mhm.
if he was really clearly the best jungler on that team, they would have just used him every game. So there's a lot of that was kind of taking down blank and Peanut on the list for me.
Yeah, going down the list, like ambition seems pretty high there. Wolf also seemed pretty high to me. If we're just like, what things like most jumped out at you
Yeah.
guys as like
Mhm.
things that people would have knee jerk reactions to? Because Wolf to me, I remember MSI, right? And like he just absolutely destroyed at MSI. The Zyra play that everyone remembers, flashing over the wall, and he deservedly got a whole bunch of credit at that tournament. But then going back to Korea, the summer it was not the same for him, right? He was even talking himself about like, I'm sorry to my fans, I haven't been practicing that much. So,
Mm.
a little bit more of the recency stuff, but he's pretty high, on the list as well.
Well, they did make that big, like run towards the end, and Wolf's definitely fixed his performance. And I think it then goes back to the idea of criteria. Like if you guys are ranking or your criteria is covering like longevity of career, consistency, what you expect, and then you look at the tried and true of Wolf, then he deserves to be there. But that's why the criteria and like the video is so important as like a pivotal point. It's
Yeah.
probably like the most important thing. You cannot just release a list like this, and it's almost even more valuable to know the individual criterias of every single member, like Deficio, Papa, and Jat. Anytime, like Papa spoke very heavily with me about creating a top 20, and my initial gut response was always like, hell no, I would never want to go near that landmine. That is a disaster.
It's fun. It's
fun.
exciting.
Super
Landmines
fun.
are fun to
Exciting.
dodge.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Like, do you put Reckless on the list? Do you not put Reckless on your list? Do you put him 21st? That's probably the
another one.
biggest landmine that happened on this list. What's your opinion about Reckless on the top 20? I put him, let me see, double check where I put him, so I'm not doing that wrong.
Well, he's not on the
We
list.
didn't
I'm looking
publish the
at.
list below 20, but I did rank to 30. I had Reckless at 22. Where would you theoretically put Reckless on your list of top
This
20
is-
players?
this
Was
is
put you
hard.
on the spot, experience the pain.
Keep in mind
top
that they
20.
have Sven at 16. So
Yeah.
Yes.
Sven is very easily comparable to Reckless. 'cause
Which is
they-
the really difficult part, because Reckless was the MVP of the league. So you need to
Yeah.
have like a really good justification of why you would put Sven above Reckless. And I would look at the MVP as this regular season award, and I would look at Sven in playoffs versus Reckless in playoffs losing to Misfits as the main thing that distinguished those two, as well as Sven's consistent performance over the past year and a half on the international stage, being a top tier 80 carry every single game.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely rate Sven quite a bit higher, and I think that the MVP is at least what from community side is really kind of making things a little bit confusing, right? They're
Mhm.
saying, well, how can Reckless not be on the list when Sven is on the list and Reckless is the MVP, so Reckless is better than them, so he's not like. But I see Sven as a better player, as a super consistent player internationally, and we're talking specifically about Worlds. I think that is very, very important. He, as you said, has had
Mhm.
a lot of incredible performances, and when I look at Reckless, I think that he had great performances in EU. He has a very unique play style. At Rift Rivals, it did not work, whatsoever, and that's another thing for me that would have detracted from it. I would not have put him in my top 20. I was not surprised by seeing him outside the top 20. I mean,
Mhm.
Deficio did have him at 20th.
Mhm.
He's the only one who actually even had him in there. So to me, it's not a surprise that he's not on the list. But I can very easily understand how it's super confusing, right?
Oh,
When
yeah.
you're saying how is he the best player in the league, and he's not on the list when Sven is.
I really like this topic of regional MVPs and how those weigh into it. Aside from everybody's personal, whatever you viewed and which players you may want
Mhm.
or not want on this list.
Mhm.
It happened also. I think we were talking with Papa and Deficio Frost about the Scout and Shahoo issue, where it was a similar thing, right? Because MVPs, regional MVP voting is usually like a game by game basis. So if you were the biggest, carry factor or something in that
Right.
game, then you get 1 point. However, you don't get negative points for super bad games. So
Mhm.
those types of awards, the
Depending
MVP
on the
votes,
MVP
they
system.
really it really rewards risky plays, and it doesn't detract from your amount of MVP votes or whatever if you also have low lows. So people
Mhm.
who spike very high and also have dips,
Yeah.
don't really get punished by that system.
Likewise, in the LPL system in particular, obviously, if you're the winningest team, you're going to get the most MVP points. And it doesn't matter if you have like a life saving, performance on the other team. If your team loses, you can't be up for the MVP, even though you probably deserved it for that game. And then that gets into the argument like, can you truly be an MVP without actually winning the game?
Mhm.
My view is I look for the
It's
best
tough.
performing player, but there's definitely like a debate either way. Like last split, we had Doinby as our MVP in the LPL, and this guy's team won absolutely nothing. But he was that consistent that when they did make those occasional wins, that
It was
by
always because of him.
the ranking system that he got it. This time around, it was between Xiaohu and Scout. Scout actually got the MVP for the final. Xiaohu got the MVP for the split. But going into the final, because it was RNG and EDG, normally the LPL would have just awarded the award to Scout because technically he had more MVPs since EDG won more games. But they decided that the performance
Mhm.
was that close of a race that they were going to wait until after all of playoffs.
That's ridiculous.
It's not
That's ridiculous. to
not
me.
the greatest system.
It's not a regular season MVP anymore. Then it's just
Yeah.
Yeah.
the entire split, which
What's
is just a
the-
different award.
Yeah. Anyway, to speak to Xiaohu and Scout, I think this is another interesting thing to talk about. I mean, this is probably like a little unfair to Deficio and Papa Smithy. Feel free to disagree with me, but I want to talk about some of the stuff that we had the most disagreements on and just kind of get your opinion on it. So,
Mhm.
Scout was high on my list. He was 11th on my list. He didn't make top 20 for Deficio or Papa Smithy, so his average ended up being 19th. Do you think I had Scout too high or they had Scout too low?
Can I say both, maybe?
Do it. Say whatever you want. Say 19 is the appropriate ranking for Scout.
Because, like I was saying before, and I have not watched all of Scout's games, but I did get a pretty good
Mhm.
chunk, and I tried to go also back to the beginning of the season to get a little bit of context
Yeah.
there. He did have a high amount of variability for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was really funny that like he named his in-game name is Scout because he rarely does scouting, and like scouting is all about gathering information.
He's scouting with his
But
face, Kobe.
Scout will go for these big plays, and like in the finals, I'm like, oh my god, he's like saving this whole game, and he's just absolutely carrying.
And
them.
then you're like, oh my God, he's trolling.
LeBlanc is like everywhere, and
Yeah.
he's like he sees one person, and like without complete information, he goes for this big play, right? And he pulls off the big play. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I love him. He's the best.
It's funny because as
then
I
he
was
does
doing
it.
my VOD review for this list and I was watching all of Scout's games, I started with some of his best games and I was like, this
He's a
guy's
god.
amazing. I put him at like 6th on the list. Like he was way up there. And then I slowly moved him down to where he ended up sitting.
I mean, the thing about Scout is, did they know that you had Scout so high on the list when they made theirs? Like, did
Yeah.
they see that he was too high and then like, oh, we can't have him on the list because we got to
No,
tank
so
this?
I would like to say that there was no gamesmanship with this list, but we did see each other's lists as they were iterating. So, for instance, like they'd see Scout really high on the list. Like I think the first time they saw my list, I had Scout at 7. And then like there's a lot of debate that ends up going back and forth, and I will also continue to watch Scout games to drop him down. So the list did move, but there was no like I have to make sure Scout is not 18th, so I'm going to put him 27th. Like
Yeah.
there's none of that going on.
I mean, the thing that people really need to understand about Scout, especially if they don't watch the LPL, is that he's effectively like 2014 Pawn 2.0. And 2014 Pawn was actually a great player, and Scout can have those highs, but then you kind of mix in like 2017 Pawn occasionally, where you just
Oh, no.
kind
Just a
of,
little dabble of 2017.
just a
Pawn.
smattering, if you will.
Well, KT was good. I mean, that's a
oh.
good pawn.
Yeah, but and that's like Scout. Like you watch some games, like if you only get a selective piece of Scout, if it's like a Lucian game, you're like, oh my god, this guy is the best mid laner in the LPL. This guy's a god. Why did he ever leave Korea? But then you see some of his Talia games where he just like single-handedly costs his team the game. You're like, okay, I understand.
He just seems like I really agree with Kobe that he does seem like high variability, right? Like because he's always a guy who to me seems like he wants to go for the big play. When you always go for the big play and it works, you look amazing. When you go for the big play and you fall flat on your face, it looks real bad. And I mean, the finals is a good example with the LeBlanc games, but I think a lot about the Cassio game when I was trying to think, how good is this guy? The first game of that series, he had such a good start on Cassiopeia, and he's trying to make all this stuff happen, and he's just not really respecting the fact that he could get ganked, and he's dying over and over and over. And when you look at like the hallmark of who I think a lot of the greatest mid laners are. When you think of Faker, everyone is always going to have to kind of compare to him. It's a guy who is able to draw incredible amounts of pressure and still find effectiveness, right? And
there were points where
there
he
were
was
points
not,
where he does,
where he was
yes, but there's also points where he's not. It felt like he's so confident in his own ability that he doesn't respect his opponents is almost the impression I get from when I watch Scout. And sometimes you're like, okay, well, maybe you don't have to, right? But then there's other times where he pays for it. Like, to your point, some of the Talia games, the Cassio game, I thought in game number 1, I thought he had opportunities
Was
to
this
perhaps
the
carry.
Lucian Cassio matchup?
I think it was Cassio into Syndra, I believe. I think
Okay.
for game number 1 of the final.
Because I know that there's also a case, and the LPL has a history of doing this, where they will pick Lucian into Cassio, because obviously, like, Cassio can really disrupt that matchup with the miasma, and she has to play aggressive to beat Lucian, at least in the LPL. This is how maybe the matchup works differently for you guys. But the LPL will do that knowing that Scout will be pushed forward. So they'll put themselves in a losing matchup to expose the pushing Cassio to open up gank opportunities. And they did this in the past with the Twitch Lucian bot lane as well, where they would pick the losing matchup knowing that they would get shoved in to open up the jungler possibility.
That's always such a risky strategy.
Yeah.
Both teams should, like, if you're saying this is LPL
Get
meta,
kinda ganked.
should
Move
know
their
this,
junglers
and
there.
it's so easy to
Yeah.
send, oh, my jungler's going to go with my winning matchup. We
Yeah.
win
Mm.
2v2.
Anyway, also, like, we ask these questions with me, Deficio, and Papa Smithy. Like, really watch that video if you want those as well. The
Or
other,
just don't watch the video and flame him.
yeah, that's also what a lot of people like doing. Speaking of Flame, I'm gonna keep going back to
You
this.
keep doing that, and
Yeah.
every time you do that, I feel like you're going to start talking about Flame. 'cause
He's
at
definitely
Worlds,
not on
but
this
he's not on
list.
Yeah.
the list.
On
and
the
I
list,
just,
there you go.
I'm
Yeah.
disappointed every time. Why isn't Flame on the list?
Where
He's a
would you
top
put him,
laner.
Kobe?
Top
Is he the third best top laner at Worlds
No,
for
I
you?
would not.
Yeah, the last two that I think are worthy of I want your opinions on is, can Longzhu have 4 of the top 6 players? Like, can you have the 4th best player on a team be the 6th best player at Worlds?
I think because you guys are not rating teams, right? This isn't necessarily a prediction that Longzhu will win. They should be set up with a very good chance to win, if these evaluations are correct. But, you're not taking into account coaching. You're not taking into account team play. Right?
I think I completely agree. Like, we were actually having this conversation earlier, and I think it not only applies to Longzhu, but some of the LPL players, and some of the conversations I heard about that. People like, there's so many LPL players on this. This is ridiculous. Like, they're not going to win Worlds. Well, this is individual players. It's not how well they work together. It's like, do you smash your lane? Like, are you making crazy plays? And yes, it can be working with your team as well. But, like, to me, it doesn't feel that unreasonable because of how good they looked in the finals against, the pretty much agreed upon best team ever, and how dominant some of them have been individually. Like, it felt okay. And also, it's just like, when you look at the list, like, it sounds ridiculous at first, and then I'm looking at this list and I'm like,
Who do you put above him?
who goes above him? I mean, you guys have essentially the added up list has Wolf as number 7, right? Should Wolf be above BDD? Should Kuve be above BDD? Mako, Bjergsen, like,
Exactly.
It gets hard to make the argument when you're actually looking at, all right, okay, well, it's sure they shouldn't be up there. Who should, right? That's where it gets hard.
And I think, like, let's say in a perfect world, like KT Rolster actually made it into Worlds, then suddenly this list, you would expect all of those players pretty much in every single position to
Is that a
start filling
perfect
them up.
For
For
KT, it is.
Some people it is. So I don't think
Yeah, I
it's
agree.
unfair to just say that Longzhu have some of the best players in their position in the world.
Since we were just talking about like Wolf, I brought it up before. Are there any like specific ones that stand out to you? Because Mako is below.
I wasn't gonna say it.
right? And just I just want to like poke the bear a little bit here. How do you feel?
The thing about Mako's really interesting because I always want to say that I think Mako. The safe statement is that Mako is one of the best supports in the world. The statement that I actually feel is true is that Mako is the best support in the world. But
Better than
that's
Gorilla.
so hard to justify because he's not playing in the toughest league.
Mhm.
He doesn't have the same longevity as someone like Wolf or Gorilla or even Mata, and we don't get enough exposure of like Mako against those lanes. But if you look at the context that we do have of Mako, like let's say 2015, because that was when EDG actually won, their international title. Like, can you say that Mako is the best support at that point in the world? Some people might say yes, because if you win the tournament, you win the championship at the time. I say no, because it was so early on into his career that we didn't know the longevity that he was going to have. But now looking back 2020 hindsight, maybe you say yes, because now we knew how consistent Mako was going to be, that he has multiple international appearances. I don't think there's ever been a Worlds like, yes, Clearlove's collapsed, Mouse has collapsed, but I don't think anyone's been like, wow, this Mako guy, he's really not playing well. He's played with multiple different ADCs. He now has an ADC in iBoy who's only played 22 games and like takes him, wins the championship, reverse sweeps across from Uzi, and is now like going again into Worlds. And it's hard. Like,
Yeah.
I feel that Mako's the best support, but he just doesn't have the career or the opportunity to prove it yet.
So, what is it that you think actually makes him better than Gorilla? Then that's what I would be really interested to hear. Like,
So if it's intangibles like leadership aspect, Mako proved this time around. He's now the captain of EDG. He's one of the primary shot callers. He brought the team back into greatness. They finally they're the premier organization. He now has 2 LPL domestic titles, and anything that is great about their macro shot calling does come back to him. And they are one of the smarter, cleaner teams in the LPL. Like again, not the LCK. So if it's the intangibles and like the leadership, when you're comparing to someone like Gorilla, like Mata, I think you're even there. Then you have to look at like the mechanical aspect, the playmaking, the importance that he builds into it. I think if you take Mako and you slot him into, let's say, it's hard because Prey and Gorilla have been a duo forever. You can't break that up. But like if I take Gorilla and I slot him into EDG, I don't think EDG get better.
I wanted to go back for Gorilla so much there, but
Go to bat.
I feel like we're gonna get bogged down in individual
Right. I mean,
discussions. But keep in mind, Gorilla also is working with rookie jungler on his team, and that's important for supports as
Yeah.
well.
But most of Reddit would say, but Mako is working with Clearlove.
Hey, Clearlove
man.
at Worlds.
Clear Love 7, his 7th season and 7th LPL championship or something like that.
I think that Clearlove like dodging away from Ashes in a straight line from last Worlds like 10 times in a row is just like burned into everyone's memory
Yeah.
too.
It's not great.
Yeah.
But what that is an example of, like even just the Mako versus Gorilla discussion, is there is a lot of room for interpretation on lists like this. So that's why we tried to make it 3 different people from 3 different regions. So like you can disagree with it, but you can be like, oh, I understand how they did it. So watch the video. I'm sorry
Watch
to
the video.
Perks and Perks fans that I'm essentially the sole reason. I have to talk
Well,
about
you just
this.
gonna I was gonna say
I
you're
have
just
to talk
gonna
about
throw
this. I
that
can't
out
just
at
leave
the
this.
end.
So there's a lot of questions of how Perks isn't on the list because he was 18th on Deficio's list and 19th on Papa Smithy's list. I had him at 26th, so that dropped his average down to 21st. They were 2v1ing me in the honorable mentions portion of the video, being like, Perks is great. And I don't think he's a bad player. I just hadn't seen enough like either international consistency or even domestic consistency to warrant him being in that club of the mid laners that are actually on that list.
so people are obviously immediately going to say MSI.
Yep.
What would you say to his success at that tournament, to his performance, specifically against a faker, right? Even if you're just looking at that, like how well he performed as an individual, even in their losing series, I thought was pretty incredible at MSI. Was that just not enough for you?
Yes, it wasn't enough.
Like, I mean, as far as like longevity, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly. So he had the good game or 2 against Faker, and he had the good series against Team WE. He had an okay group stage. They lost almost every early game in that group stage. He had a bad Rift Rivals, a bad Worlds 2016, a bad MSI 2016. He was 3rd place in the All-Pro voting for regular season in Europe behind Febiven and Caps, who isn't even close to this list. And he had a really bad quarterfinals against Sencook. So, like, yes, he did have that high at MSI, but he had a lot of other good or mediocre performances that just stopped me from putting him in that club in the top 20. Because if I'm just comparing him against like other mid laners, I did have Maple, I believe. Wait, no.
28th.
Yeah, I had Maple close to him. I had him at 28th. But then like I'm going up my list, like I have Blank, Ruler, Reckless, Sword Art, Condi, Double Ifs, Van Karsa. I'd have to rank him with Crown, right? And I'm not putting Perks on the level near Crown. And I'm also not putting him on the level of Scout, which was the big disagreement between Deficio and Papa Smithy. So that's essentially my argument. And I'm curious if you guys think Perks belongs in that club.
So here's my question about like the logic then. So if the logic is about like longevity and consistency of form, then I have to look at Con and why Con is so high.
Or BDD.
Well, here's the thing, right? Like, it is about trying to predict how good they're going to be at Worlds. Like, it's not this in a vacuum, you must check 7 boxes and he's an 8 out of 10 in this and a 7 out of 10 in that. Like, Khan was so dominant and so good, so close to Worlds and throughout that entire summer split in the most competitive region. It's like, boom, he's up there. But Perks, his MSI performance is also separated from his regular season performance. And yes, he had the good final, but that just wasn't enough to put him way up there. And it's like, I actually also don't think the 26 is that different from 18.
I have another little question. Did you guys also then, if you're talking about this is predicting their performance at World. Did you take into account the groups? Was this after group draw? Because Perks is playing
no.
against Crown and like Xiaohu or something. So he's definitely going to have some intense competition that's actually on this list. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll get to see.
That's the thing, right? Like, you're going to see right away
Yeah.
because I'm saying that he's not in that club. If he smashes Crown, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm 100% willing to admit that.
Yeah, but I mean, predictions have to be you can't always get them right?
Yeah.
You have your reasoning. If you can back it up, if you have solid reasons for it, which you do, then I think it's fine as long as you're willing to actually defend and can defend your prediction. we've made at least one or two. You know,
We've never been
incorrect
wrong.
For the
predictions.
record, I've been successful on all my bets that I've taken. Those are more important.
There you go. 100% of that respect. But it is interesting because only with a one EU guy made the list. Two NA guys made the list. You know, Maple, someone maybe a lot of people would be surprised to see didn't make the list. A lot of LPL people did. This is something we talked about earlier. I'm just kind of curious on your guys' opinions on, you know, the distribution between the leagues and kind of how that is defended. Because a lot of talk on Reddit was, oh, well, LPL isn't going to win. They're not going to win Worlds. They have no chance. How could they have, you know, 6 players, I believe it was, on the list? You know, and just kind of the ranking of the regions.
As far as the LPL is concerned, I think, like you said, and we talked about it earlier, the fact that you can't just look at the teams. Like, yes, the LPL teams have never met the expectations that the community has really set for them, but it doesn't mean that the individual performances or that superstar talent isn't there. We have 20 different servers, so how many challenger spots sit on a single server? Times that by 20, that's how many challenger players that we have floating around. We have a server that is dedicated only to Diamond 1 and above for the professionals to play on so they can lower their queue times.
I want to be a bronze diamond player. Can't wait.
We have LPL, LPPL, LSPL, TGA, and then like the LCK, which is effectively the LPL tryouts at this point. Just like, who are we going to start sniping off next? Like, we literally came into Kespa Cup one year. I was like, well, welcome to
You
the
just triggered
LPL.
somebody.
Yeah, I'll get an angry tweet about that. But you know what I mean?
And they haven't, like, I agree. I always say that I think China should eventually be like the esports power, but there's a lot of factors that work against them, like with Korea's experience and how good they are at the top end. But even with that, China didn't make semis last year, but they have consistently been the second highest performing region at Worlds. I look at even individual game win rates. So that takes into account all the LPL teams who have bombed at Worlds. They still have the second highest regional win rate of all regions at Worlds. And 66% of LPL teams have made it out of group stage since they switched to this format 3 years ago. So they are clearly the second best region historically.
And the thing is,
quarterfinals matchups, right? Like
Yes,
that's so much of what it is. They keep getting Koreans in the quarterfinals, and guess who's the #1 performing region at Worlds?
Yeah.
Well, it's the LCK.
Man, they're so lucky they never play other Korean teams in group stage.
And while I'm totally fine to like ride this hype train right now, I will pull it back. Like, don't misunderstand. I do not think that there is a massive gap between like China and EU or NA. And actually, this is a really cool Worlds because this is actually the opportunity that EU in particular, because they're actually the closest in evening up that record, could overtake China as in terms of like overall wins as like second historic strongest region, which is why this Worlds is even more important. But so much of that mentality about like, you know, China's not actually the second best region, they've fallen down, really did start at 2015. But if you cut away that Worlds, 2016, you know, that was a bad quarterfinals matchup. 2016 Worlds, a very similar thing. I know that there's also the EDG versus like Fnatic best of 5 that comes to mind, but there are very limited instances.
It's also
Yeah, Kobe's got it.
Yeah.
Kobe was going to
This is
say
the first time
he agrees with everything that you said.
there's been a recent trend also that I've noticed with both Europe and NA recently because Rift Rivals for Europe and for NA the last couple of years at Worlds, where both regions are like trying very hard to set low expectations heading into
So you can
Worlds this time
overperform?
around. So we're both like trying to like
They're not that great. They're not that great.
You're better. No,
So
you're
it's
better.
like, hey, everybody calm down until like we actually win some games, we get out of groups or something like that. So that's also pretty funny how we're both like trying to get as low as possible.
On the topic of Rift Rivals, I'm only going to get riled up about this once, so this will be quick. The lashback and the can I say bitching?
You
Sure,
can.
you
You
just
have.
did. Yeah, it's too late.
Jat has dropped the
Jat
most
did 2 swears
censorable
in one
words.
episode. Two
Two
swears.
swears.
We don't have a swear jar yet, but we'll
No.
go one.
The aggressive complaining about the Rift Rivals format. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm by no means saying that the Rift Rivals format was more prestigious than winning like a best of 5, but it is super disingenuous to completely eliminate any type of LPL credit by taking away the Rift Rivals victory.
Or NA. Here.
Or-
Yeah,
Great
Rift
job.
Rivals.
Yeah.
We
Missed
are
the
all
high
on the same
five.
page. Rift Rivals
There we
was the
go.
most important tournament of all time, and clearly demonstrated the strength of our regions.
Okay, continue.
So
continue.
But the thing is that format is used in other esports like StarCraft. Having a
StarCraft, very competitive esport.
super competitive. Koreans are supposed to be
Yep.
really good at that.
Yep.
Why weren't they better at this
Yep.
Rift Rivals format? I don't know. But it's the topic of EDG knew that Samsung, like the LPL coaches revealed their notes afterwards. They knew that Samsung was going to come out first. They almost 100% predicted their draft. EDG said, we can beat Samsung, had the confidence, went out and did it. Team WE matched up across from SKT. It's not like, we pegged off like these weak teams
Yeah.
and like cheated a victory. We
You beat
went-
MVP 4 times. No,
Exactly.
you didn't. Just beat him once.
And yeah, it does suck that it was MVP and not, another higher end LCK teams. Like, there's definitely debate here, but completely saying or throwing out Rift Rivals, it doesn't mean anything. There's no reason to be excited. Like, there was legitimate victories there, and it
Yeah.
was legitimately won.
It was extremely exciting, and I think that is how Rift Rivals should be played, like the preparation. To me, it should be an event where the regions are working together, and I think the LPL demonstrated that best. I didn't really even hear about that at all from NA. It was just kind of 3 individual teams fighting, and I hope that's a world where it can get to, because I think that's a very exciting event to watch, and it's much more than about the regional pride instead of just, I hope Cloud9 does well, or I hope, EDG does well. I hope LPL does well. I hope the NALCS does well.
Yeah, I think it's also a good transition to get us, moving to the start of this
Mhm.
Worlds. That teams working together actually is an important thing for LPL, because like teams that didn't even make it to Worlds, they're going to the boot camp and stuff. I keep hearing about how they're like uniting as a region.
Flying in.
Yeah, they're like uniting against their common
Wave
enemy,
flags.
the rest of the world. So that's kind of neat, and we'll see if that has an effect on Worlds boot camp and that type of stuff. But shall we transition a
Yes.
bit further
Go,
into
the
the
meta.
show, because this list is long and we'll just stay here all day.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on the next Top 20 episode that we made. Check out the video that we posted on Lolly Sports as well. But it's time to move on to patch 718. This is a fairly recent patch. Most notably, it is the Worlds patch. So the main topic of this discussion will be, A, is there anything that stands out to you as being particularly Worlds impacting on this patch? And B, just what do you think the Worlds meta is going to be? Because that's what this patch also entails.
I mean, I think the big one to me as far as standouts was actually Casio, because Casio has gotten a number of nudges, a number of changes, and I feel like is kind of a very different type of mid laner than most of the others.
Mhm.
There's not really many mid laners who are like tank killers, basically, right? Who are people who can just act as another AD carry type role and just be a frontline killer. Because
Mhm.
when you think of champions like that, it's like, okay, well, you can make the argument for Vel'Koz and stuff, but no one really plays it. I mean,
Mhm.
who else is there that really does this? Maybe Talia, if Talia is able to move around very well and constantly use workaround to hit the front line. But there's not a lot of champions in that grouping. So I think that the changes to Casio are impactful, because I think that people will still play her regardless, because there's not someone else that they're comfortable playing who kind of fills that role.
Right.
But this means that you could be abused even harder in some of these bad matchups, right?
And I also think it's really cool that whenever Cassie's in a game and seeing the experimentation of like trying to figure out how to deal with that lane, like we've seen the Vel'Kozes come out.
Mhm.
I know in some of the wildcard regions, emerging regions,
Mhm.
that they're using things like Kog'Maw, AD Kog'Maw, Rush, Wit's End to try to deal with the Cassiopeia. So trying to find like these long range options. Victor is also starting to crop up more. And like just taking a step back and looking at the Worlds meta, normally going to Worlds, I've been pretty skeptical of a lot of the patches that it's playing on. It feels like super skewed one way or the other, and I think that this is actually a really good, like genuinely for once, like a really solid patch to play on, where you have enough kind of fringe picks or versatile options. You can play the defensive heal barrier supports. You can play the all-in engage like the Alistar supports. Callista's still really strong despite some of her tweaks. So I'm actually really happy with the 718 Worlds patch.
Another mid laner, as we're talking about Cassiopeia, that also stood out, and not necessarily because the Rise buff is like super big or anything, but sometimes a buff is enough to remind people about a champion. and with the rest of the control mages in mid lane receiving nerfs over several patches, I think it would be super interesting if we did see
Mm.
Rise come back. You know, we have all these hype plays where there's realm warps and it just kind of blows people's minds and makes for really big moments in the game. So that could be one interesting one. But as usual, I'm most hyped for the jungle. And
Okay.
you mentioned a little bit, but the Ezreal and the Nidalee um, are really, they have very interesting possibilities because while tank junglers have gotten nerfs, I still think that the barrier of execution for teams that are like full offense is very high.
Mhm.
But it does give more options for teams that would want to go, the con strategy, right? If you have a snowballing top laner and you pick Ezreal jungle, like you can just run
Right.
over that side of the map. So if you have strong lane with Ezreal jungle, those possibilities are very interesting.
Yeah.
But then you still have the problem of, do we ever get into a point where we've made a mistake, the other team got enough money that they have a tank and they can team fight, and those issues start to crop up. So I always like when there's a balance between
Yeah.
those two.
And that's the two biggest swinging points I have on the list is the battle between tank junglers and the warrior / Nidalee junglers of the world, and then the battle between playmaking supports like Alistar, Thresh, and Rakan versus the heal barrier bottom lane Ardent Sensor users. Like those are the two things that currently feel like they're in a pretty good balance, but could shift over in one direction heavily and like drastically change the game. And then the prediction is like, will I think that happen? One thing that I think will happen with the heal barrier things is I think most teams are actually going to settle on that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think the Rakan nerfs are big enough that you can now like ban out Alistar and maybe deal with Rakan and then just go heal barrier and get to the late game. I hope that doesn't happen.
Also, with the support pendulum kind of swinging between those two sets of supports, Ivern and Nidalee with their buffs are actually also Ardent Sensor builders. So now we have more options if you want to incorporate Ardent Sensor, which every single AD carry and their mother does 100%, no questions asked. If they want to build the team comp, then you actually have more options than just support now.
Yeah.
And I was actually checking in on LPL top laners to see if they were doing anything odd, and they're running now Karma top against Cho'Gath specifically with the Athene's Ardent Sensor Rush build.
Sick.
I'm not a fan of solo lane Karma, so I hope that doesn't take off. But
I've seen a lot of it. I watch a ridiculous amount of Tracking the Pros, which is the Korean solo queue stream that just tracks Worlds players. I've seen a lot of mid lane Karma. I was seeing a ton of jungle Ezreal, but now I just assume it's banned every game because every time I was seeing it, it was going 12-1, 13-2. Like that's a very real power pick that, to get back to the other point, like the jungle could be hype. Like if we see Nidalee Ezreal slight Gragas nerfs, is Sejuani strong enough early game? Like, are there enough tanks, or can you just ban the big tanks and then push it into a carry jungle?
Well, and part of the thing that's working into that as well is that Cinderhulk lost 25 health, but Knight's Vow lost 100 health, right?
Yeah.
And people
the cost was also reduced.
the
for that,
cost was
so
reduced 100.
That's a little bit.
So it's a lower health, cheaper item, but also less efficient.
Yeah, well, it's 100 gold less, and it lost 100 health.
Yep.
But I'm just talking about 2-item completion. Yes, it will be 100 gold earlier, but with the Knight's Vow bonus HP down plus the Cinderhulk multiplication on that, you're essentially a Ruby Crystal less in health for 100 gold cheaper, right? So you could say you have 400 gold less health for 100 gold less. So that in combination with the fact that some of these tanks have been nerfed and the buffs to some of these other champions and the fact that they are very popular does kind of skew it a little bit because yes, it is more risky perhaps to play these DPS champions, but when you do get quite behind as a tank in the jungle specifically, like junglers don't have as consistent of an income as say a top lane tank. So that's where I think the games can sometimes spiral out of control as far as like, oh well, this Nidalee got way ahead of you and you're Sejuani, you're now down a couple levels, you don't even have access to your own jungle. Like that can get really tough.
Unless you have mid lane control, and your mid lane's gonna protect your Raptors, then everything's fine. So that's why it's like everything's connected, right? Mid lane can protect the jungle. If your jungle's not good, bottom lane's supposed to be ganked for the day. You need your Ardent.
So what do you think's gonna happen? Do you think we'll see carry junglers, tank junglers, or
I think we'll see both.
100%.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be, at least from LPL, we're definitely going to come out pretty hard and fast, except for EDG. They'll use the tank junglers, but
they'll play clear love. I think Jarvan might go back to warrior.
He already has in solo queue.
Yeah. I think it could happen in pro. Like, it really depends, but Jarvan is one of those guys who can early gank like a top lane to hard camp lane and take over the same way like an Ezreal or an Nidalee would, just not quite as powerful if you end up seeing those junglers banned.
The other thing that's really interesting to me is almost without fail, I'm seeing people complain about AD carries who are not AD carry mains. And then almost always I see the AD carry mains say, no, AD carries suck. The reason AD carries are good is because of all these OP tanks that are standing in front of us and defending us. So if it actually does go to a carry jungle meta, it'll be interesting to see if we still have all these like Kog'Maw type comps and these Ardent Sensor type comps, right? Like, is that as easy to pull off if you have the Ezreal with a warrior or whatever
Yeah.
versus the Sejuani who's building a Knight's Vow second and then a Locket and then all these sorts of items that also like not only you're
Yeah.
frontlining but you're also buffing up and protecting your carry. So like I do think that is kind of intertwined. The more tanks you see, the more you can see of those Ardent Sensor supports, the Kog'Maws, the Twitches, these
Yeah.
sorts of things. And the more carries you see, the more self-reliant AD carries you want, like your Ezreals or your whatever.
The meta is very delicate.
Yeah.
Because if we think back to before the Cinderhulk buffs, who were the meta AD carries? The utility ones.
Yeah.
The Jhin, the Ashe, and the Varus. Because if you lock down someone in a world of nothing but squishies, you get the kill,
Mhm.
right? But if you have a huge tank, then those guys can't carry over it. So it's all those thresholds. And once the threshold is reached, everyone shifts over that. So that's the struggle that I think the balance team was trying to solve coming into this world. I hope they did it, right? Like I hope they found that point where the threshold is unclear, which
Yeah.
could happen.
And even if they don't hit the point exactly, the reason I like them switching it back this direction on this patch
Mhm.
is that Worlds Bootcamp is not enough time for them for teams to fully solve it, right? There
Yeah.
will be teams that still think the other path, right? Even if it's the less traveled path. I think that we will see both strategies.
But the scary thing is that if like say Korea just comes in and just starts smashing people with a specific style, they tend to decide like the tournament meta, and that just feels bad. You know what I mean? Like if they decide that heal bearer is the way to go and they keep winning with it, then other teams are going to
Stay
slowly
strong,
start
Khan.
transferring.
It's not
It
the
only feels
meta.
bad if
Just
they
keep
choose
playing
Janna and
Jace, buddy.
Sejuani as the meta. If they choose, some crazy stuff, then
Yeah.
it's okay.
Also, like I do agree that people do often look towards Korea for like how to play the game, but more often than not, I think going into Worlds, like Korea's week one struggles are because they don't have the same meta read as others, and then they just adapt to it and beat you anyway. So
That was always the StarCraft world where it was like if you come up with a new strategy, you could beat Korea with it once, and then
then
the
never
next
again.
tournament they were just gonna do your strategy much better than you could, and you were never gonna win again. But you got that one
Yeah.
time.
Let's remember back to Shanghai with the glory days where Korea admitted to learning the meta from Afram.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Oh, yeah,
CLG
the
glory
at the
of
tournament,
it.
and then
Uh-huh.
beat us. Yes, that was great.
Yeah. Unlucky.
Want to move on to play-ins? Sweet. So Froskurinn has joined us. You will be casting play-ins soon. It's in 2 to 3 days, basically, depending on how you're going to read
23rd?
about time zones. Yeah, it's the 23rd, but if you're on Pacific time, it's actually Friday night at like 10:30 is when the games start, with the opening ceremony being at 10 Pacific time. For those of you who don't know, we have play-ins this year. There's 12 teams auto-seeded in the group stage. Then we have like these 4 major region teams as the top seed in every group. Hong Kong Attitude from the LMS, Fnatic from EU, C9 from NA, and also Team WE from the LPL. And then a bunch of emerging regions formerly known as wildcard regions. Like, what stands out to you from this play-in?
I mean, the thing is everyone's going to give the benefit of the doubt to the power regions, the big four, the Hong
Mhm.
Kong Attitudes, Fnatic, Cloud9, and Team WE. I think a lot of people are just trusting my word that Team WE are actually the strongest Chinese team. So theoretically,
I think they're in the conversation for strongest Chinese team.
in the conversation.
Yeah.
So I think the more interesting topic is actually, do the emerging regions actually have a shot? We saw the Gigabyte
Mhm.
Marines, so, people are still a little bit unsure if
And ANX, right?
anytime CLG goes to Worlds, they like to give hope back. So
We've seen every team that CLG has ever played.
Exactly. And so going into this, I was really trying to prep and figure out, who are the actual emerging region threats. And it kind of comes down to 3 teams for me. It comes down to, in no particular order,
Okay.
Gambit, the Dire Wolves, and Fenerbahce. I
Okay.
think are the 3 teams to really pay attention to, because we're only in groups of 3. So if you drop, 1 or 2 games, suddenly you can very
So,
easily.
I was looking at it. If you drop 2 games, then that is a reality. I feel like if you only drop 1 game, then they're going to be
There'll be a
fine.
tiebreaker.
Yeah, because I mean, it'll have to get funky.
Yeah,
But
well, it's single
two
round robin.
two games is not
it's
very much.
double round robin best of one, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a double round robin best of one with
But it's
three
only
with,
three
with three
teams.
teams in the group. So
So
you
it's
only
if you
four games.
split, then
So-
you're tied, and you would have to do a tiebreaker.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly,
Both be 3-1.
because if you lose 2 to the same team, then you're probably screwed. And if you lose 1 to each of them, and then the other team, 2-0's the other team, then you're also screwed.
Yep.
That would make things super interesting. So I immediately, before we even like discuss the rest of that, I wanted to ask you guys, like, which group do you think the highest possibility of one of the
Hong Kong
top
attitude.
4
I was gonna say Group
losing
D.
2
Yep.
games? Because I also thought Group B is a possibility. I hate to say it there for Cloud9, but as you're talking about Dire Wolves and Team One, like, people could come into these games, they're best of ones, with some sort of rushdown strategy, some cheese strategy, as people like to say. Take that Gigabyte Marines attitude, and if that happens twice, then there you go. Everything's gonna be upside down.
Well, the craziest part about it is so this is double round robin, right? But stage 2 is the top 2 seeds from each of these groups move on. They play a best of 5. That is one best of 5. There is no losers bracket to that. So if one team, kind of messes it up, say it is Cloud9, right? Cloud9 loses 2 games. They could then get paired with, say, Fnatic or Hong Kong Attitude or whoever. Then that would mean that one of them is guaranteed to not make it into the world's group stage. And Cloud9, say they mess up in their best of ones, but they play well in best of 5. Well, they could actually screw over Fnatic or whoever else.
I know. That's what I'm saying. 2 games determine so much.
And that also, for looking at through the NA lens, it really does affect things for the world's groups, because if all 4 major regions make it through, WE gets slotted into TSM's group, right? And that is, the strongest North American team. That is where most of the North American hopes lie. And if WE is, as Froskurinn says, the best Chinese team, that is very scary. So you're actually hoping that one of these major region teams don't make it through, because that could actually mess with where these teams get placed and mean that TSM is not guaranteed to get WE, although they still could.
Yeah, it's long and convoluted, and like make sure you're following along. One thing I wanted to ask you about Frosk though is this Hong Kong Attitude team.
Yep.
Because a lot of people actually rank them higher than AHQ.
Yeah.
Explain to me the Hong Kong Attitude roster.
So Hong Kong Attitude started as Hong Kong Esports. They've actually gone through 2 rebrandings over the course of the year, and you have to understand that in the LMS they started 1-6. And then they finished 6-1. And on the back half of their most recent split, going into Worlds, the thing that put them here, they went through J-Team, Flash Wolves, and AHQ, as well as Raze Gaming. So all of the top teams, this team does have tape taking down, including beating Flash Wolves from a 10K gold deficit. So Hong Kong Attitude, when you talk to them, they don't think that it's just AHQ. They think that they're better than Flash Wolves. I don't know if I'm ready to give them the benefit of the doubt. A lot of their players are very
Never
untested.
believe the team themselves.
Exactly.
We did great in scrims. We're really good.
I saw that one on Reddit too. No, but you just have to. It's so hard to judge LMS. Personally, I watched a lot of LMS. I tried to over-index in it this split because I wanted to feel confident talking about these teams.
Right.
I watched that region. I watched them very heavily for Rift Rivals, and going into Rift Rivals is like the LMS is not great right now. They're super reliant on maintaining lane phases, which slows down the tempo of their game because they want to exploit the individual matchups because their player base is so small. So across every single team, they're gonna have one player that's just infinitely better than the guy on the other side, and they want to isolate those matchups. Things like that. In this case, I would say like Sword Art. But then that meta doesn't fly, or that strategy doesn't fly on the global stage. So you can't, it's really hard to look at LMS, figure out what their meta is, see what's making the team strong. And then if you try to extrapolate that to a global stage, like that's never going to work. These teams are going to get blown up. But then they just change and they play completely different. So you never know what the hell to expect from them.
Yeah, I like talking to Nelson a lot. He's the assistant
Analyst,
coach or analyst for HKA, and he's always so confident in particularly their laning phase, right? And their like one-on-one matchups and stuff like that. But I don't know. It does seem like there's a lot of doubt as well if you look at the rest of the Twitter analysts just for LMS about the region as a whole. And you talked about them, giving Flash Wolves such a hard time. That has kind of brought down the expectations
Rather
for
than
the
bring up.
entire region, right? Rather than like boost HKA up to like, oh, they're gonna come in like the new Flash Wolves, better than Flash Wolves or whatever. It's kind of lowered the overall expectations for the whole region. Even though these guys on Flash Wolves particularly, just because they make every international event all the time, and that's kind of our benchmark for the region. Even though they have so much history and so much consistency, and it's the same guys. People are like doubting them more, and by consequence, the whole region.
But even if you look at some of these really well-known names like Maple, Karsa, and even Ziv from AHQ in particular, Westor,
Not the
Chowie,
best season.
really rough seasons. I was actually, kind of going all the way back around the top 20 that Sword Art wasn't ranked higher than Karsa. Because in my opinion, if you had to pick an MVP from the LMS this split, it wasn't Karsa, it actually was Sword Art. But of course, it was a very like jungle support roaming type of meta. But it's not to say like Karsa's going to come in and drop the ball, because you can never hold that expectation, because he always proves us wrong. But Karsa is not playing to the same standard, at least domestically, that I think most international fans would expect.
Yeah. And I also want to talk about Gambit, CIS. They're in Team WE's group, which I think is the hardest #1 seed in the group. So there's a likely chance they get a #2 and then have to play a best of 5 against C9, Fnatic, or HKA. I'm trying to figure out if I think they have a legitimate shot of making it, because CIS is obviously the region we had Albus Nox Luna in last year. They were able to take, 2 games off of COG. They beat a Korean team in the group stage. Like, they have done it before, whether or not you think they can do it reliably. And based on that history, I want to give them like the credit and be like, yeah, they can actually do it. But when I watch a few of their games, like, they don't look that clean. So what are your thoughts on Gambit coming in?
I mean, my thoughts on emerging regions as a whole is that, so there was this world where the teams actually just weren't that good, right? For a long time. So people didn't prepare for them because you didn't need to prepare for them. I think we're now actually in a world where, after ANX showed up and after, Gigabyte showed up, you do have to take them seriously. You do need actual preparation for these teams, or you will lose to them. But if you do prepare, I still do think that they are a step below. And that's like my honest opinion on it, because when you look at ANX at Worlds, they were pretty vocal. Lecrit was talking about how they couldn't get a single scrim. They were just playing WoW and whatnot because no one would actually play them because they thought they were crap. And then once they actually started, beating people, everyone wanted to scrim them. And then you look at how they performed against H2K in the quarterfinals. They looked very figured out to me. It looked like, okay, well, you kind of had your fun. Now everyone knows what you do and you can't win. And that is kind of the world in which I think a lot of these teams live. And I'll be happily proven wrong. Like, that would be great. But I think that we have seen, if you don't prepare, you're going to lose. I think teams will prepare, and I don't really think that these teams will do as well as we've seen ANX and Gigabyte do.
This is a perfect opening. One of the reasons why I talked about Group B also being a possibility for those upsets is because of the great social media interactions that were going on. where
Cloud9,
not
Team
only
1, and Direwolves. So it's NA, Brazil, and OS.
not only did Jensen tweet out, "I just watched the whole group drop. I still have no idea who we're playing against."
Yeah.
To your point of like, not only do like they not care really much about these guys, the reason these jokes are so funny is because there is truth to them, right? The top laner of Direwolves is then tweeting at Impact like, "Oh, I'm gonna smash you," and he's like, "Who are you?" And he's like, "I'm your new rival." Like, he's trying to become Impact's rival, and Impact is actually like, "Oh, that's cool. Nice to meet you. Like, who are you?"
And Impact goes, "Nice to meet you. Who are you again?"
Yeah. And then the other guy's like, "I'm gonna be your rival." It's like some anime where like the 5-year-old kid is like,
Impact
"I'm
just
coming
patting
for
him
you,
on the
Goku."
Yeah.
It's hilarious too, because the Direwolves are such a it's like it's the Australian team. Like the Aussie
Yeah.
Bants are pretty intense with that team. And while it's I agree with you, it's like the anime like Yu-Gi-Oh, like, I'm gonna go on an adventure, I'm gonna find my rival, like Gary Oak rolls up. They are very much, if you give them a microphone, they will like shit talk
I mean,
super hard.
Direwolves going into MSI with that plan, they said the only team that should beat them is SKT. Everyone else is easy.
Sure.
It's the only team
Fire.
that should have beaten them, to be honest. They just underperformed.
And there's also history between
Just
these
like
teams.
TSM Worlds, baby.
Contracts and Schernfire both played in the NACS. Schernfire is the big star player, and like the reason why I rank Direwolves so highly, and I was watching Cloud9 VODs at the same time that I was watching Direwolf VODs, they're very similar in their playstyle and kind of how they function as teams. I think there's a bit more weight for Direwolves on Schernfire, where there's more weight on Jensen, but it's that very strong mid jungle synergy. You can carry from every single position, kind of a more inconsistent top laner, but can play versatile play styles. Like, I just think of Direwolves as like the mini Cloud9.
Point is, though, Cloud9 have not done any prep unless these
At
are
the
like
time of the group drop.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
At the time going in, they had not done any prep to even know who these guys are. Not saying like that's not enough time or whatever, but not only is it hilarious, but also if it's true, which it seems like it is, then it would be like the most recent prep. And Schönfire, when he was here playing in NACS, he was I definitely remember him in solo queue, and like he was definitely impressive in solo queue, but I don't really like there weren't really like standout moments from the CS games.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see, contracts actually playing against him while they're now.
Contracts has I was looking at the stats for this. The highest solo deaths of any jungler, I believe, or he might be second highest attending the tournament.
Mhm.
I actually think pretty highly of Contracts. I'll talk about that more in plans. But Schernfire is really good at tracking people. He's very clever about Fog of War, and he's a fairly intelligent jungler about how he plays around the vision. So I'm just really curious if Contracts, gets the Nidalee pick and puts his nose in it, if Schernfire can actually punish that.
The one thing I do remember is Fire did play Nidalee in NACS, which was a very long time ago,
Mhm.
but that means that he could also pull it
It's
back
really
out.
cool, yeah.
So
A lot of these guys can pull out the carry junglers. Diamond Procs, Ezreal, Nidalee.
that's so cool.
You never
Diamond
know.
is back at World.
Yeah. To kind of wrap this discussion up, everyone does know, generally speaking, like the major regions. Frost, since you've done the most prep on this, like aside from Gambit, who is the team that you think has the coolest story in here, or like, and as well as that, maybe the best chance of maybe pulling an upset?
Ooh, coolest story. I think it's actually okay. Coolest story is definitely Brazil's team.
Okay.
They are actually the fairy tale
Yeah,
happening right now.
challenger to first place
Yeah,
to Worlds.
4 months. That's how long they've been on this ride, and they went through all of the Brazil powerhouses. And when you talk about Brazil as an emerging region, it's probably the one that comes in close towards the top, towards CIS as well, because we expect good things from the Brazilian team. So that story is incredible. In terms of who I actually think is going to pull an upset or who is scary, it's a tie. I think Gambit stylistically are very different than any of the other play-ins teams. They play much faster. It's so funny. We get all these notes from the teams. It's like, we're a heavy macro rotation strategy team. We're a 5v5 team fighting team, heavy macro. Like, it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
And Gambit are like, we're going to blitz you. We're going to roam. We're going to go really hard and fast very quickly. So it's a very up-tempo type of game. And if you want to talk about catching people off guard in a best of one, I think stylistically that's suited for Gambit, who I think is the most consistent team and just kind of played in the overall strongest region. And this is coming from a lens that I have most access to these players. I actually think it is Oceania. I'm watching the Chiefs versus Direwolves. There's moments where I look at the play and I'm like, this is the correct play. The execution is fumbled, and it's not perfect by any means, but the drafts look much closer to what you see in the power regions. You see the Korean influence coming through. You see the North American and European influence come through. Whereas you look at the other regions, there's a lot of these random pocket picks that teams are still really reliant on.
Yeah, I'm reading through the Twitter questions as well as we move towards the end of the show. We just answered it. Zanzibar asked for play-ins episode, which wildcard teams are most likely to make it to the world's main stage. Kobe, you got one?
Check.
I say Fenerbahce, just because I feel like
The only thing
Turkey's
about
been pretty
So
strong.
we have to take into account the groups then, right?
Yeah, you do have to take a little bit. They just have to finish second in groups, and then you never know who they're going to get drawn into.
100%. Fenerbahce have the easiest group, and they're also probably tied in there. It's now a matter of like how much better is Frozen than all of the other players there, because that team is so reliant on Frozen and Thaldrin.
And just to be clear, that group is Group D. It's Hong Kong Attitude, 1907 Fenerbahce, and Rampage, which is the Japanese team.
Yep. Sweet.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it'll be pretty interesting to see. I'm very excited for playing. I do think there is the possibility for upsets, especially because it only takes one team. Like Kobe said, 2 games, and we have a best of 5 between 2 of the major regions. Going to be exciting, but we can hop into some more of the Twitter questions.
You know this guy's name very well. Who sent us our next
David
question?
Peterly, my
Yeah,
boy.
nailed it.
What champions might make a surprise appearance at Worlds? One-off cheese picks or sleeper OP picks? I mean,
Surprise is a hard word.
yeah, because if you have not been following, the meta outside of just watching pro games, then I think Nidalee and Ezreal would be very surprising to you. If you have not been kind of keeping up with what people are playing going into Worlds. But a lot of analysts, a lot of pros are expecting that. I think maybe one area we could see a lot of surprise picks though is in the play-in, because like you talked about, some of these teams are still reliant on the crazy picks.
Like Kira and his Anivia.
I do think that also, while like people are talking about Ezreal and Nidalee, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about Ivern. So they're probably a subset of boosters that are also like, that's not surprising at all. But I think that Ivern actually could come back in with all the focus on Ardent Sensor and it allowing so many of these good supports to actually be on playmaking supports and still get an Ardent Sensor.
It's also Rengar. Condi, particular in the play-ins, he played Rengar even when he fell out of fashion, and like as the jungle pool gets moved around, Rengar starts to become more viable.
Yeah, and
I
like
went legendary on him yesterday with our game with Isaac.
That's true, and then
Thank
we
you very
lost.
much.
We both went legendary, and then
Yeah.
we lost.
it's so interesting, right? Because this is the lowest amount of disruption I feel like we've had from patch to patch in like many past worlds. So to
Mhm.
try and say like what one-off pick or like sleeper pick is hard because we've seen a lot of them. Like, does our evolved Kha'Zix count? Probably not, even though Clear Love has played that. So like
Mhm.
it would be surprising to a lot of people who haven't watched Clear Love, but it wouldn't be surprising as far as that gets pulled out. Maybe like Poppy appearing in either the jungle or the top lane. We have seen that. So like maybe we see it again. It's interesting. I think we're going to see a lot of diversity at Worlds this year, though.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Here's an interesting question. I mean, this is obviously kind of pointed at one team, but maybe we'll talk about some others. Jeremy Thomas asks, "What are some of the most talented rosters to miss Worlds in League history?" Everyone's thinking
KT
KT.
roster?
You don't get to use that as an answer. You guys are more the League historians here. So, what do you think?
Miss World.
SKT.
I was gonna say SKT
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Samsung.
Boom,
Oh,
2014
he stole it, Kobe.
SKT.
What else you got?
Yeah. They didn't make it in because Najin Shield made it in.
Yeah.
Team
I'm-
WE missing 2016 Worlds because IMA had their
Oh,
miracle
that was
run.
another really good one.
Because
yeah.
this is the exact same roster that had a good showing at MSI and is now projected to have a good showing coming into 2017 Worlds. And that was a massive upset. They literally lost 55 minutes in game 5. They had more gold and had outdamaged every single person on the team and still lost the game.
That's pretty crazy.
I'm just gonna go with one player.
Okay.
Score.
Let's go.
Oh, yeah, that's
Fair.
fine.
He's a
Whatever.
team.
Yeah,
he's
he
the
is
team.
the team. I
Uh,
think if you're looking at NA, maybe you could make the argument for, well, it's kind of surprising if you're looking at last year to this year, CLG. Maybe is pretty surprising when you think, okay, MSI, best performance ever, Worlds, one game away from knocking rocks out of groups. 2017, where they at, right? Didn't even make Worlds.
If you're a real
All right.
CLG fan, you would not be surprised by it.
in typical Worlds fashion, we're going to do final question here from Dreamers Esports, which is a good name for this question. All memes aside, how does NA win Worlds, both this year and in the future?
This year, I think you're hoping for some tragic wrist injuries, perhaps, for some of the best teams.
Whoa,
Yeah.
that's dark.
No,
You
no, no.
get
I'm
real-
going to give a real answer. Okay, we've seen you can get a good path if you're lucky enough with draws. If we assume the 3 Korean teams win their group, and we assume that somehow TSM, either doesn't get WE in their group or finishes first, that means they don't play a Korean team in the quarters, which means they could make it all the way to semis without playing a Korean team.
Mhm.
So that's the path to get you the closest to like 1 or 2 best of 5s away
The
from being
problem
able
is
to win
you still
Worlds.
need probably to win 2 best of 5s against Korean
Maybe.
teams
But
to
wait,
actually
But
win.
here's my question. Which Korean team, like if you had to pick one, would you
Mhm.
prefer TSM?
Samsung.
Samsung, yeah.
Samsung.
Boom. And then WE took down SKT again in the other semifinal.
There you go.
They beat WE just like they did back at IM Katowice 2015. World champions.
Yeah, I mean, it requires like the NA team playing the highest possible level they've
Yeah.
ever played, and I think the Korean teams playing at a much lower level than usual to win multiple best of 5s in a row against these teams. But I mean, for the future, that's more what I'm kind of interested in,
Right.
because the future is kind of maybe more realistic. You want to jump in?
Or something that we really have not seen, mid-tournament innovation,
Mhm.
where how I don't know how they would finagle having a good practice partner for this, but if they're able to keep some innovation that late in the tournament, like
Mm.
away from the other side of
Mhm.
it, then that might be a way. But that's also like fairly low percentage
Yeah.
chance to do, because you both have to find a reliable and very good scrim partner to keep with you that late.
Yeah, highly unlikely. Frosk, how does NA win Worlds?
I think you said it your best. The same way that China keeps making it to the semifinals, just a sculpted, easy route and bracket.
I mean, for future though, I do think it's possible, and I think the way that NA wins Worlds for future is more of development of the region as a whole. You get lots of great orgs. If you have 10 teams taking, League of Legends and Worlds as seriously as TSM took it last year, and you have that for multiple years in a row, rosters taking it this seriously, maximum amount of practice, maximum amount of preparation, great support staff, great analysts, great coaching, league development of, talk about Academy League, a successful Academy
Mhm.
League. You need the whole system to be working really well, because you need top level competition to improve, right? You
Yep.
cannot have one team being the best to like always improve. It's so hard if you're better than everyone else. You need all the teams level to rise. Then you can improve as a region. Then maybe you can realistically think about winning worlds in the future.
And I think the key to that is money. And it will
Mhm.
all come back to money, because if there is substantial amount of money in it, not just because, oh, players want to have money and everybody wants to have it, but if you have that security, then that you go back, you can like build up more talent, right? Parents of kids who are in Challenger but don't have guaranteed prospects will
Mhm.
be much more likely to be behind them, putting more time and more dedication in. A lot of things people always point to for Korea specifically is the dedication and the tenacity of these guys. Like, they're just playing insane amounts, and they put so much work into it. If there's more money in the United States,
Secure future.
or for North America, I mean, Canada as well, you guys are included. Then I
Thank you,
feel like
thank you.
if parents are behind it for more kids and they can dedicate more time and stuff behind it, then maybe they can get to that level.
Sweet, easy. It's gonna happen in no time whatsoever.
I just, I don't know. I don't know if you're like trying to close the show,
Go ahead.
but my
Yeah.
thing is like I agree with that. Like, but to play devil's advocate, like endemic sponsorship in LCK has kind of hit its ceiling. We have like the big sponsors
Mhm.
in the LCK. You got the SKTs, the KTs, and there's still that really strict culture of the parents don't want their kids to go. Like, yeah, it's technically safer, or everyone knows what pro gamer is in South Korea when you talk to them, but it's still not like that's fine. Go off and play StarCraft. Don't be a
I'm
doctor
not
or
saying that
lawyer.
it's like that in
Right.
Korea. I'm
Yeah.
saying that for the North American ones to get to the level where they're,
You need
able to
security.
put that dedication in, we would need security here. I'm not saying
In
that
NA.
Korea has that
Yeah.
security.
And to be fair, the Rocks Tigers couldn't get a sponsorship.
But that's the thing. So
Right?
like,
Yeah.
so if the conversation is like money builds infrastructure will build better talent, which means that we have a better shot at winning worlds. Like, we have the best region in the world that, while it does have great infrastructure, it wasn't necessarily built in those means. And there's still those instances like the Rocks Tigers where those factors don't add up, and you still had greatness. So it's like, why can't NA translate that?
It's much easier if you have money. I'm saying
Right.
that there's
Yeah.
for us
Yeah,
to
the
be like,
theoretical
oh,
question of why
everybody,
would you?
yeah.
How could you?
They,
Yeah.
I'm saying that
Money
Korea,
helps.
they have more dedication. They have, all these hours that they're willing to put in. Without that, for us to catch up, we would need incentives. I think.
Yeah. Either way, that's a conversation for another day, another time. Thank you for
My
the
bad.
questions. No, it was good. Good conversation. That will do it for this episode of The Dive. Thank you for the questions. Always send them in. # The Dive LOL. You can tag any of us on Twitter. We're also going to be doing these kind of throughout Worlds. We'll have a few more on video. Other than that, it'll be audio only. And World
Yeah.
kicks off.
Yeah, Worlds kicks off September 22nd at 10:30 p.m. Pacific time as we take on WE, rather, not we. WE take on Lion Gaming. We can't wait to see you there. I'm excited.
Hype.